How's it going, everybody? Welcome back. Thank you for clicking on this video and join me for yet another movie review where today, because we are getting closer and closer to No Way Home coming out, we are discussing Marc Webb's The Amazing Spider-Man. So after Spider-Man 3 didn't exactly work out, and with the director Sam Raimi calling it quits, Sony decided to reboot the franchise to hold on to the rights to make Spider-Man movies, so they called upon Marc Webb in 2012 to reboot the franchise with a new set of actors and retell the story of Peter Parker's transformation into Spider-Man, this time around played by Andrew Garfield. So if you were around back in 2012, this movie was heavily marketed as the untold story. We were finally going to learn what happened to Peter Parker's parents. And while the marketing of this movie, looking back, is kind of misleading because this movie doesn't really focus all that much on the disappearance of Peter Parker's parents. The film does set this up in a way that creates a mysterious background for these characters, and the decision to look into the background of Peter Parker and his parents does help to define these series of Spider-Man films from the Raimi trilogy. But it also doesn't really go anywhere. After about the first act of this movie, the disappearance of Peter Parker's parents isn't really looked into anymore, and they kind of just drop it. And thus, the film just kind of focuses on a lot of the Spider-Man stuff that we've seen before, and not always done in the best way, in my opinion. But before all that, let's address Andrew Garfield in this movie. Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker is drastically different from Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, and I think this was a really smart decision. By going in a completely different direction with the portrayal of Peter Parker in this movie, it really helps to distinct these Spider-Man to their specific series of films, and really helps Andrew Garfield get out of Tobey Maguire's shadow just a little bit quicker. Although sometimes I do feel like they try a little too hard to separate Andrew from Tobey. Andrew's Peter is not as black and white as Tobey Maguire's was. He's smart, but he's also a little rebellious. He doesn't always listen to authority. He's got a lot of attitude and a lot of mood. He's got a number of different hobbies such as photography, science, and skateboarding. And a lot of complaints from Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker, especially in this first film, is that he's too cool to be Peter Parker. And I definitely feel that from this movie to a degree. I think Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker does work for the modern age. I like how his Peter is more of an outcast and an introvert and kind of keeps to himself. He's not so much the bookworm stereotypical nerd that Tobey played in the Raimi films. And honestly, the problem with Andrew Garfield's Peter being too cool, I think could have been fixed if they just took away the skateboarding aspect of his character. There's just something about making Peter Parker a skaterboard that gives him too much of an edge, and it's just an added little thing that makes it harder to believe that this guy would be picked on, that he would be at the bottom of the food chain in his high school. But Andrew Garfield gives a really good performance in this film, and I really like how they deal with Peter Parker in this film getting his powers. I like the way that Marc Webb really looks at it through a real-world lens. When his powers start to kick in, it's really presented almost like a body horror. Peter doesn't really know what's going on. His spider sense is going haywire. He can't control his strength. And you get to see Peter Parker dig into this research, trying to figure out what's happening to him, which is something the Raimi films never really went into. Tobey Maguire just kind of like accepted that he was now this strong, buff, didn't need his glasses anymore superhero. I do think in this way they do utilize the science aspect of Peter Parker's character a lot better in this movie. It's really cool to see Peter Parker in this movie work on and build his own web shooters, and Andrew Garfield just pulls off all of these scenes so excellently. You totally buy into this character through his performance. But where it becomes clear why Marc Webb was chosen to do The Amazing Spider-Man is when you get to the relationship between Peter and Gwen Stacy, played by Emma Stone. The chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone as Peter and Gwen just leaps off of the screen in this movie. It's well known that this couple would go on to date in real life, and when you watch this movie, that really comes as no surprise. They absolutely blow the competition away when it comes to romantic relationships in the Spider-Man films. They're just so endearing to watch as their relationship develops and grow. It really is the heart and soul of this movie, and they do an excellent job connecting this relationship to Peter Parker's life as Spider-Man when you get to Dennis Leary as Captain Stacy, Gwen's father who is trying to arrest and hunt down Spider-Man for being a vigilante. It gives Peter a great dilemma as Spider-Man in this film, and it gives these three characters an engaging, complicated dynamic with each other. And it's clear that this romance and these relationships is where Marc Webb's passions lie. Because I gotta be honest, when it comes to the Spider-Man essential story beats in this movie, I really feel like they missed the mark. Yeah, I really think that in many ways they botched the Spider-Man origin story in this movie, and the root cause of that is really with Uncle Ben's death. Martin Sheen and Sally Field as Aunt May and Uncle Ben are really good in this movie. First off, they get a lot more screen time than Rosemary Harris and Cliff Robertson got in the Raimi films, and it really gives them a benefited chance to help establish these characters and their relationship more, and the family unit dynamic overall with Uncle Ben and Peter and Aunt May. Uncle Ben doesn't die until about 45 minutes into this movie, so Uncle Ben and Peter get a lot of time to establish their relationship, but this movie feels so desperate to not be called out for copying Raimi that when it comes to monumental moments in Peter's life, such as the great power comes great responsibility line, they make Uncle Ben spew out this.
He believed that that if you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's what's at stake here. Not choice, responsibility.
It's not necessarily a bad speech, but by having it so wordy, I feel like the impact and the importance of those words in Peter's life gets lost amongst the character in this movie. Not once in The Amazing Spider-Man do I feel like this is why Peter becomes Spider-Man. Peter doesn't really feel like he reflects or even gives a second thought about these words from Uncle Ben. And when these words are supposed to define the hero of Spider-Man, that's a big failure on The Amazing Spider-Man in my eyes. Strike two is the death of Uncle Ben. I think the way that they do Uncle Ben's death in this movie is handled kind of sloppy. From the get-go, even with the setup, Peter can't afford milk from a convenience store, so a robber in line behind him steals it for him while he's stealing cash from the register. Then the clerk actually asks Peter to chase down the guy with him, and as a reasonable person, Peter declines that insane offer. So then the robber trips and falls right in front of Uncle Ben where his gun slips out, and Uncle Ben goes for the gun. You idiot, you just step aside, old man. And then what do you think happens? Of course he's gonna get shot. Not only does this scene lose the weight of Peter feeling like Uncle Ben's death is his fault, I mean, you can argue that Uncle Ben died because Peter left in the first place to go get his milk, but it's just such a loose connection for me, and we're supposed to believe that Peter should have chased down an armed criminal after he robbed a convenience store. And what's worse is this does a big disservice to the character of Uncle Ben. In his last moments, he comes across as a fool. And finally, strike three. Spider-Man is born. Not out of great power comes great responsibility. Not after Uncle Ben wanted me to fight crime. Spider-Man is born out of revenge. Peter is not trying to stop crime. He's not trying to be a hero with his powers. He's simply just going after people who he believes might have the mark of Uncle Ben's killer, and when he doesn't find it, he just lets them go and forgets all about them. And Peter just never feels like he naturally grows into the crime fighter Spider-Man for good. After a montage of Peter failing to track down Uncle Ben's killer, eventually he just kind of drops it. The movie just forgets to complete that subplot. It just goes away once the lizard enters the scene. Now, I actually really like the setup for Dr. Curt Connors, played by Ifans, in the first half of this film. He's a scientist who lost his arm and had been working with Peter's dad to find a way to grow it through cross-species genetics. The movie does a great job of making his character sympathetic and giving him a connection to Peter Parker. But once he becomes the lizard, his character is just so lazily written. For a film that feels like they are constantly trying to run in the other direction of what Raimi did, it's really lazy and unnatural that the lizard in this movie is just insane, like most of the villains were in the Raimi trilogy. And the movie doesn't develop this very well at all. Once Dr. Curt Connors becomes the lizard, he just suddenly moves his laboratory into the sewer and believes that every single person in New York City now should become a giant mutant lizard. And for the majority of this movie, Marc Webb has this film in such a grounded position. He's really trying to give us a realistic Spider-Man, almost like a Batman Begins kind of movie. So when this giant CGI mutant lizard comes into the scene, it just doesn't feel like it fits the world that Marc Webb has created. It feels completely out of place to me in this movie. And maybe this could have worked better for me if the lizard was a better written character, but because the lizard is developed so poorly, there's nothing about this villain that's compelling or interesting to me. Because of all this, The Amazing Spider-Man is a really frustrating watch for me. I just don't feel like Marc Webb and the filmmakers behind this movie really understood who and what Peter Parker and Spider-Man is. Even the end of this movie, after Captain Stacy is killed at the hands of the lizard, and as his last dying wish, he makes Peter promise to stay away from Gwen. Immediately after making that promise, Peter Parker just turns right around and just breaks his promise and continues to date Gwen. At no point in this movie does it feel like Peter Parker sacrifices anything to be Spider-Man, and Peter Parker needs to make sacrifices in his life to be Spider-Man. That's what makes the character so admirable and lovable, is the fact that he does this Spider-Man crime fighting because he knows it's the right thing to do, because that's what his Uncle Ben taught him. Despite the fact that it makes his everyday ordinary life more difficult, it just never feels like Peter learns with great power comes great responsibility in this movie. Now, I know by now you're probably thinking that I really hate this movie. I don't hate The Amazing Spider-Man. I can enjoy The Amazing Spider-Man. As mentioned before, the romance between Emma Stone and Andrew Garfield as Peter and Gwen is the strength, heart, and soul of this movie. The performances and chemistry of all the actors are all very good. Some of the Spider-Man sequences are a lot of fun. I do enjoy watching Spider-Man and the Lizard fight in the high school, and Andrew Garfield is a very fun Spider-Man, even if I don't necessarily like how this Spider-Man is created in this movie. But in the end, I really don't think that The Amazing Spider-Man is a very good Spider-Man movie, and because of that, I'm gonna give it a pretty weak not recommend. What did you guys think of The Amazing Spider-Man? Comment down below, let me know. I want to know all your thoughts and opinions about this movie. Join me again in a few days. I'll be talking about The Amazing Spider-Man 2. That's gonna be a fun one.
My favorite.
As always, guys, thank you so much for clicking on this video and checking out my channel. If you like talking all things movie, TV, and all things entertainment, why don't you go on and click that subscribe button, click that like button, click that notification bell, all that YouTube stuff. And I hope to talk to you guys again real soon.